The next paper is Ionospheric Effects of Substorms with James Whalen.
This is the plot in magnetic local time and latitude, where the dotted lines show the approximate position of the Feldstein oval. And this funny line here is the aircraft track here, staying stationary approximately at local midnight and intersecting ISIS 4 times for a total of about 9 hours. The ISIS tracks, starting with B, C, D, and E, are ones that we connected with exactly during the course of this flight. ISIS measuring particles and topside soundings and photometric measurements. And so we attempt to have the best of both worlds, a ground base or air base observations and satellite. In addition, on a similar scale, we intersected the DAP system, large-scale pictures of which this is an example. Here are the lights. Perhaps you all have seen these particles. Is that visible? Here are the lights of New York, and you can make out the geography from the moonlit conditions here, and actually the aurora lit. There's a artist's conception of where the aircraft was. I'll move on from that because I thought that at first illustrated a substorm, but actually it's in between 2 substorms, and I'd hate to speak too much about that. And to go on instead to the totality of the DAP pictures spanning this entire flight. That is, we were in the picture here, in a sense, except for the first and last of these, where this is UT in every case, and showing something of the variety of the aurora on this perfectly normal day. That is, there's nothing unusual, except perhaps, and I don't believe you can see it here, very, very thin, not arc, but band of E layer, alias diffuse aurora, which is confirmed, it's difficult to see in this picture, confirmed also by the ISIS particles. There's one substorm period here, and various events which I won't go into in detail. Here was a very well-defined substorm, and as no one would argue with this one, that's what it is, that actually there were 2 DAP satellites. This is midnight, and the subsequent one, so about 20 minutes later, shows the formation of the westward surge directly over us. It's much more interesting, of course, to look at the pictures, but to show some idea of the variability of these 2 forms of aurora, the discrete shown between the dotted lines here, versus UT again, plotting now in a magnetic latitude. The discrete aurora, not evident in the first picture here, appearing here to be entirely coincident with the continuous or diffuse aurora. The dotted lines then outlining what the oval did during this time, and the solid lines what the continuous or diffuse aurora is doing. Of course, there's a big gap between here. There's an orbit missing. In fact, this continuous diffuse aurora made a very rapid change, apparently, at the time of the first substorm. I think one is struck by these are KP here, by the way. One is struck by the variability here, and I'm sort of depressed by this slide because it looks very much like pictures I remember of Brownian motion, if you've ever studied it. And I won't go into the implications of that. Substorms are defined in terms of discrete aurora, that is from all-sky camera and visual observations. And to that end, we made observations from the aircraft between the limits here of the horizon. That is to say, this is magnetic latitude, universal time. These 2 straight zigzag lines are the horizon of the all-sky camera. The straight lines are arcs, And we see, and this shaded area is continuous diffuse aurora, which is not seen by the all-sky camera except on the horizon. But it's clear from this presentation that there is a poleward expansion here, this poleward motion of this arc. There's another one here. There's a third one here. And then the aurora disappears, contracts here. What I've attempted to do is, if these are visible, I can't see it at all from this position, that is to make this little symbolic display of where, for example, here, this line indicates a brightening, this one a poleward expansion or expansion, and here a contraction, to delineate in further data where, within a minute or so, where these times are of these phases of the substorms. I suppose that this is the longest prolonged such observation of this sort, and we've attempted to look at and define, in fact, all the substorms that occurred, in fact, try to contend with everything that happens here. It's interesting to note that there's a brightening and a poleward expansion, but no subsequent contraction. So whether that's a substorm, a complete substorm or not, is a question of definition. There's another expansion that follows that, and then contraction, and very rapidly another brightening, expansion, contraction. The picture that I showed originally falls right in the crack there. And I would know, since it takes a couple of minutes to unfold that picture, I wouldn't care to interpret that too carefully. Here, interestingly enough, there is the first brightening separated by arcs which are shown here outside the all-sky camera horizon, but were obtained from the Alaskan chain of all-sky cameras, here and here. So that one, in fact, during this period after this brightening, saw surges over Fort Yukon and other things in a very dramatic expansion. The ionospheric effects, the most striking one, is given by the sporadic E seen by the sounder. And again, I've shown the substorms and substorm phases here. I neglected to mention this is a brightening and apparently no other. Let me go back one. Oops. Yeah, I thought I was going back. Well, no, it's out of phase here somehow.
Can you run back about 4 slides? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's it, thanks. Here there was a brightening and no apparent poleward expansion, but I just note that in passing. Now if we could have the next slide. There we go. This high-frequency sporadic E turns out to be perhaps a signature of substorms here, which I've shown here in their separate phases, that if one looks at the 8 or so megahertz sporadic E, that they seem to define a comforting and possibly more objective way of obtaining a signature of the substorms. Generally, one would expect that they're related to discrete aurora and seem to be very closely associated with discrete aurora. Again, this first brightening phase here occurs when there's no aurora overhead, and this is a very interesting time, and we'll go into that at this time. The other general observation that seems to be very significant here is the so-called red band 6300 angstrom emission scanned out by the photometer, seen in a circular scan at about midnight and about 2200 as we kept approximate station here. And its motion seems to follow the substorms and their polar expansions in here and delineate the bounds pretty much of the F-layer effects associated with the substorms seen by the sounder as very disturbed F-layer. In addition, it seems to include also the continuous aurora, that is the E layer or diffuse aurora, and there's apparently some kind of a hyperoval that observationally is very comforting to know what's happening to the bounds of the precipitation as a whole during this time. Let me go on to one thing that is not really related to the ionospheric effects of substorms, but rather to the care of defining when substorms occur. And I may briefly, no, next one. No, go ahead, to the last one, I guess it is. Imp I was fortunately, fortuitously in the magnetosheath near the bow shock. This is this Earth radii in the dusk sector. And plotted here is other measurements, plotted gamma, total field measurements, which appear to be going between about 30 and say less than 10 a gamma in phase with these polar expansions. That is, in every case, except this, and since it was outbound, presumably this was the transit. As I understand it, the interpretation of this is that this field strength of around 30 gamma is magnetosheath, 10 gamma is interplanetary field. So that this transition, strikingly enough, seemed to occur, this flapping, if you will, occur simultaneous with the polar expansions here, in every case, except this one, which is perhaps the motion of the satellite out through that interface. As I say, I don't think this relates directly to the ionospheric effects of substorms, but rather it's a very surprising and interesting result.
Thank you.